Okay, so maybe we can get started. We have a quorum for sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Crumwitty, Dean of the Architecture Division at California College of the Arts. On behalf of the Architecture Division and the Critical Ethnic Studies program, I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural Sandra Vivanco Memorial Lecture with Mabel Wilson, who will deliver the lecture Practice as Pedagogy, Sandra Vivanco and the Work of A+D. Sandra Vivanco, beloved professor of architecture and critical ethnic studies at CCA for over 20 years, embodied much of what I believe we all value about our CCA community. A passionate educator and collaborator, she believed deeply that what we do matters and was committed to using her talents and energies to make the world better and brighter. It's fitting then that this lecture honoring Sandra should be part of this year's series, Remaking, with which we are reflecting upon the work we must do now to remake our practices so that we can co-imagine and cooperatively build a just future. This is a cause that Sandra committed herself to every day in her teaching and her practice, and it's an honor to carry her legacy forward with the inauguration of the annual Sandra Vivanco Memorial Lecture in partnership with the Critical Ethnic Studies program at CCA. I'd now like to introduce Shyla Pacheco-Hamilton, Chair of the Critical Ethnic Studies program.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their culture and their communities. CCA honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future, here and around the world. And we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us from virtually today. We recognize the sovereignty of these nations and advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous resources and practices into traditional art and design practices. And now I'd like to pass the mic to Lisa Findley.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce the inaugural Sandra Vivanco Memorial Lecturer. As Keith mentioned, Professor Mabel O. Wilson is the perfect person to launch what will be an annual lecture in memory of Sandra. Mabel and Sandra met in 1988 as students in grad school at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. This was the beginning of a devoted friendship that stretched across the years and the continent and included mutual career support, years-long collegial conversations, and overseas travel adventures. Perhaps the greatest demonstration of their mutual bond is the fact that Mabel is godmother to Sandra's two daughters, Sophia and Ima. We have Sandra to thank also for encouraging Mabel to apply to our faculty at CCA. Mabel had a huge impact on CCA architecture in her 8 years with us. Between 1999 and 2007, she sharpened and expanded the history theory curriculum as we launched the MARC program, while also bringing new, challenging, and critical perspectives and conversations to our studio culture. This deep personal connection to Sandra is one of two reasons Mabel is perfect for today's launch of this lecture. The other is that, like Sandra, Mabel O. Wilson is an architect, designer, activist, teacher, and scholar who works with multiple tools on multiple fronts and in multiple venues toward the recovery of erased and silenced past contributions to design and our built environment by women and people of color. And simultaneously, toward an expanded future where these same people are at the forefront with clear voices and opportunities to make and remake our designed world. And like Sandra, Mabel pursues these varied activities with a fierce and unwavering commitment to changing the world. As a maker, Mabel's practice, Studio And, that's ampersand and, makes visible and legible through curation, exhibitions, competitions, and projects the ways that anti-Black racism shapes the built environment, along with the ways that Blackness creates spaces of imagination, refusal, and desire. Her most recent collaborative project is the one here in my Zoom background, the newly unveiled Memorial to Enslaved Labor in Charlottesville, Virginia. As a curator, on view right now is Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, an exhibition Mabel co-organized at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. It's the first exhibition at MoMA to feature a collective body of work of 10 African-American architects, artists, and designers, seeking to, as the New York Times put it, reclaim the larger civic promise of architecture. As an activist, Mabel is, among other things, a founding member of Who Builds Your Architecture, a project that examines the links between labor, architecture, and the global networks that form around the building of buildings. Mabel is the Nancy and George Rupp Professor at the Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and also professor in the African American and African Diasporic Studies Department. She's the Associate Director of Columbia's Institute for Research in African American Studies, and alongside Mario Gooden, is the co-director of the Global Africa Lab, which is a research initiative that explores the spatial topologies of the African continent and its diaspora. As a scholar, Mabel's research and writing investigates space, politics, and cultural memory of Black America, race and modern architecture, new technologies in the social production of space, and visual culture in contemporary art, media, and film. This work includes unflinching, clear critiques of racism and white supremacy in America and in architectural history and education. Mabel is revered for her deep archival work to uncover and share hidden histories of the enormous Black contributions to the making of the landscapes, cities, and buildings of this nation. Her scholarly accomplishments include 4 books, numerous essays, distinguished awards, and grants and fellowships from acclaimed institutions. Most recently, last year, Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History of from the Enlightenment to the Present, which she co-edited with Irene Cheng, who teaches here at CCA, and Charles Davis, was issued by the University of Pittsburgh Press. As a beloved and inspiring teacher and mentor, Mabel is noted for rigorous teaching and inventive, expansive pedagogy. In 2019, she was awarded the Educator Mentor Honor from Architectural Records Women in Architecture Design Leadership Program. You will note, as you dive deeper into Mabel's work, which is linked here in the chat, that she, like Sandra, is also a profoundly successful collaborator. This is one further way she continues to upend the narratives of architecture. Ours is not a solo activity of singular genius, but rather the result of careful, hard, and sustained effort by groups of people acting together, each contributing their perspectives and expertise to advance common cause. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mabel O. Wilson.
Thank you, Lisa, for that very kind, generous introduction. Let me see if I can get this right and not botch it up. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Yay, okay. Fantastic. And I also just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape. I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. Thank you, Keith, for the generous invitation to give the first Sandra I. Vivanco lecture. It's an honor to be here. And what I wanted to do was give a talk today about the extraordinary practice of Sandra. As Lisa pointed out, her combination of practice, scholarship, community engagement, and education is truly unparalleled And I think it's a model for architectural practice and the future of practice. Moreover, tracing a genealogy of Latin American women architects and defining Latin American cultural sensibilities in the built environment as hybridized marks her work as not only intellectually innovative, but an important invention and contribution across several fields. So I wanted to devote this first lecture in honor to what made her work worthy of that honor and worthy of emulating by future architects, cultural producers, and thinkers by citing her words and her work. So on the website for her firm, A+D, Sandra Isabella Vivanco traces the ethos of her work, practice, ancestry, teaching, and learning, all animated by her own global trajectories of migration and travel. In her practice, she exercised the profession of architecture, for which she was trained at UC Berkeley, followed by Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where Lisa mentioned we met in 1988. She worked in a host of local San Francisco offices and global practices, including Nikken Seke in Tokyo and the Pritzker Prize-winning architect Álvaro Siza in Oporto, Portugal. But practice, actual application of concepts, theories, and ideas as practice is also performance and execution. Foundational to the execution of A+D was Sandra's teaching, beginning in graduate school and flourishing in a two-decade appointment at CCA, two-decade plus appointment at CCA, where she not only taught architecture, but also fulfilled initially an innovative public design position and was integral to the formation of diversity studies, now called critical and ethnic studies at CCA. And diversity studies she described in a 2018 podcast, Design Forces, quote, looks at the cultural contributions of people of color, but also cutting across issues of gender and religion, end quote. These achievements evidence the importance of Sandra about putting ideas into architecture and community engagement that recognizes racial and ethnic inequities into action as a foundation of her critical practice. Ancestry also appears on Sandra's map. Born in NOLA, that is New Orleans, Louisiana, but then raised in Lima, Peru to a Peruvian father and a Colombian mother, Elsa, Sandra also spent time in the famous Incan city of Ayacucho, her father's birthplace. Sandra migrates as a teenager to San Francisco with her brother Lucho to join her mother. Her experiences of border crossing and immigrant status in the United States greatly informs her sense of the importance of identity in creative practices and in the built environment. Novelist and cultural critic Toni Morrison has remarked that it was migration and not technology that has been the defining characteristic of modernity, with the African slave trade being the largest and longest forced migration of peoples. So in the 2018 podcast, Sandra shared that she had a consciousness that she, quote, was growing up in the global South, in the margins, end quote, as she described it. And she also shared that at a very early age, quote, she was interested in connections, networks, and context, understanding where her place in the world was, end quote. And so thus, we must situate her practice in relationship to her own hybridized cultural identity that coalesced across and within multiple national and cultural boundaries. Now, entering into architecture, whose figure of the architect is typically a cisgendered white male, women, especially women of color, have had few role models. In part, I think this is why Sandra and I formed a friendship in architecture school. We recognized that we shared similar experiences in architecture and would need to construct our own genealogies of culture, race, ethnicity, and gender to define the concepts and ideas that we could apply in our respective practices. In order to construct that archive of presidents' creative work, figures, and experiences required research. And what this map shows us is how Sandra's work formed around a methodological framework of pedagogy, practice, and research that she returned to time and time again. And note the inclusion of learn in that list that identifies not only her places of formal education, but I would argue that learning was what she was committed to through her many activities and a passion that she shared with those, all of those with whom she came in contact, including family and friends like me. Those trajectories around the globe allowed Sandra to cultivate invaluable networks of architects, teachers, scholars, students, artists, musicians, performers, and friends. She was unabashedly committed to the integration of art into life. And the thematics of all of her work revolved around cultural identity and exploration of craft and the experience of the city, urbanization. And a 2016 grant application that Sandra shared with me, she offered the following set of critical questions that I believe it's important for understanding her rich body of work and activities. She wrote, many cultural homogeneity and financial disparity problems exist outside the traditional purview of architecture, as they are determined by social, economic, and political realities that we can only engage as concerned citizens. However, if architecture is the most public and permanent expression of material culture of a particular time, whose identity is being represented? As architects, how do we enable building types and public spaces to accommodate diverse needs while being culturally relevant to marginalized populations? What is architecture's role in this transformation? So I want to begin with ideas, with her research and writings, which I think are the substrate for her teaching and practice. I think this interest in research begins in part during her last year in graduate school at Columbia, when we joined classmates on a trip to Turkey to do field research on a project by my current colleague and then professor, Richard Plunz, in a small city on the southwestern coast of Turkey. Turkish is actually near Bodrum, for those of you who've been to Turkey. And so Richard published that work in this book. And so some of our drawings and insights are actually found in this book. We were one of several groups of students who had been making building surveys and interviewing families about life in traditional stone farm dwellings in that region of Turkey. The topic was fascinating and raised questions about globalization, like the industrialization of architecture, of agriculture in the orange groves around Turkish that had already begun by Ataturk's modernization policies, but also the impact of international tourism on local culture in Turkish that brought money as well as new forms of construction like concrete dwellings. And so you could see on the left, that's Sandra actually on the left, sitting in a chair, Gabby Abraham, and her dear friend, Conrado Lopez, when we were visiting the Roman rooms at Priene, and you see on the right a family at Turkish. And here's another picture of Sandra from Istanbul. Since the days were hot and we finished our survey work by noon, we often finished our survey work by noon. So at night, when it cooled down, Conrado, Gabi, Sandra, and I danced to club music and consumed way too much Turkish rake with our professor, Richard Plunz. But I think overall, we learned to appreciate the value of travel, to see architecture in context, to engage research as a hands-on way to learn about the world and about yourself. Travel studios forged shared experiences, built community and friendships that last a lifetime. When she departed Istanbul that summer, Sandra left for Porto, Portugal, for a 6-month position at the office of Álvaro Siza. I traveled around Europe for about a month and then met her for Porto for a week, where we continued to explore architecture and the rich culture of the region. And so that's Sandra on the left in Siza's office, and that is us both at the famous bank that Siza did in Vila do Conde, Portugal. Though Siza had built outside of Portugal, his modernism is often lauded for its regional character, contextual sophistication, and its responsiveness to Northern Portuguese landscape. Siza is somebody who's very much embedded in locale, right? And so this office building is one project that Sandra worked on in that office, in Siza's office. This was another project that she worked on, and Siza's recognized for something else that is equally important in his work, which I think had a profound influence on her, was his adaptability at spatial modulation, made possible by a sophisticated attention to detail and material, seen as this kindergarten, which was another project that engaged Sandra's talents. His office masterfully crafted form, space, and light. I think that question of cultural identity, right, that Siza certainly embodied in his work, would stay with her as she completed her studies at Columbia in '91 and returned to the Bay Area, and shortly thereafter started teaching first at UC Berkeley, before she began at CCA, and she eventually opened her own practice, A+D. I think she realized that both the Eurocentrism of architectural education and the masculine figure of the architect builder missed many important lessons from her own experiences. And she sought to find models and frameworks as springboards for her emerging practice, scholarship, and pedagogy. Sandra understood how in a sprawling megalopolis like Lima, with its modernist towers and colonial squares, in those places one could find the layerings of colonial and post-colonial cultures and histories, a striated materiality of Mesoamerican, Indigenous, African, European, and Asian cultures. Ayacucho showed her very directly how Europeans grafted their buildings onto rich Mesoamerican and Incan language of the city and of architecture. As she shares in a 2018 podcast, she was fascinated by the visual layerings of history, and that architecture served as an entry point to understanding that. She theorized in a 2005 essay, Trope of the Tropics, quote, "From the retablo to the telenovela, a theatrical, sensorial, high contrast aesthetic permeates the cultural production of Luso-Hispanic America, which finds its origins in the tragic mass genocide of Native populations under the guise of the discovery of the New World. Historically, characterized by great social disparity and a highly, almost painfully corporeal perception of reality, Latin America's artistic production cannot easily ignore the trauma of slavery, missionary conversions, language erasures, dictatorship, and repression," end quote. That theatricality of the mask, of Carnival, of a dance between two forces, sometimes violent, can be found in the stylistic contours of the Baroque architectures that she would have encountered in Ayacucho and in Cusco. And for Sandra, the synthesis creates a certain ethos around craft and high culture, local materials and technology, which becomes the trope of the tropics as found in Latin American architecture. Again, from Trope of the Tropics, she writes, quote, "To attempt entry into this exuberant and ambiguous culture, one needs to internalize its vigorous vegetation, the 4/8 beat of drums that provide the tempo and sounds of life in Latin American cities, the telluric pulse of natural phenomena, and the extreme power imbalance often rooted in illiteracy and poverty. Within a lush landscape filled with socio-political and economic contrast and excess, comes as no surprise that the first hybrid architectural products were Baroque churches. The characteristic mestizo aesthetic resulting from the native and African artisans' traditional craft and available material, emblazoning important aesthetic principles, would prove hard to classify according to existing European canons and would be recorded as provincial and bastardized. Fluent in several languages, her native Spanish, English, Italian from time in Italy, and Portuguese from learning capoeira and Sandra with visits to Brazil and Portugal, Sandra understood how hybridity formed in the wake of migrations. An immigrant that represented the figure of the outsider who can now see and absorb the complexity of adopted culture was the architect and designer Lino Bobardi, who Sandra would dub as a chameleon of Brazilian modern architecture. And Sandra would bring a traveling exhibition of her work to CCAC in 1998, the first show of Bobardi ever in the US. A complex figure, Bobardi was an adept navigator, or as Sandra posited it in a 1998 essay in the journal Aula about the show she organized, quote, "Perhaps the answer lies in her incredibly chameleonic nature and her ability to negotiate between the foreign and native, high culture and popular art, communism, fascism, male and female, architect, and healer. It is this inexhaustible flexibility coupled with the poetic that propelled her life and her work." Bobardi worked at the intersections of art, culture, and power. And Sandra wrote how these can be discerned in two of Bobardi's museums, for Salvador, shown here, and for Sao Paulo. The Baroque was a lens that enabled Sandra to understand the cultural transformations and the dynamic fusion of different languages and methods of construction. And we see here Bobardi in the middle and this very tactile sense of construction and this sort of iconic stair in the museum in Salvador. And so the materiality of reuse and appropriation animated Bobardi's work, not only in architecture, but across scales of jewelry, interior design, and exhibit design. In Trope of the Tropics, Sandra would write, "The Baroque as a lens through which we may re-examine Latin American modernism to understand it as symptomatic of a process of transculturation and hybridity. The term transcultural, as defined by the Cuban interdisciplinary scholar Fernando Ortiz, describes a category that explores crucial moments of construction and destruction throughout the history of colonialism and post-colonialism. By its very definition and processes, transculturation resists essentialism." So in Bobardi's Casa do Benin, we see this engagement of materiality, the roughness of concrete, and the technological innovation of the stair in the upper floors of this House of Benin in Pelourinho itself, Salvador. So craft merged with technological innovation of bridges, dams, and railways. This was Brazilian modernism that led to the construction of a modernist capital city of concrete in the high savannah. That's Brasilia. This also led to remarkable buildings like Bobardi's Art Museum in Sao Paulo, seen here. At the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, Bobardi's innovative exhibition design, Sandra writes that it is, quote, "a simple and revolutionary display that downplayed authorship, style, and chronology." Right? So this radical break and disruption, right, within this sort of European sort of tradition. The plaza, this is Bobardi in that space with one of the design apparatuses of the exhibition. So this plaza is an underbelly, which served as a stage for urban performance and community gathering. And so we see here under construction, right? And so you see the sophistication of this modernist use of concrete and technological and structural sophistication. Winning a Fulbright Fellowship in 2003, Sandra would eventually turn to another Latin American modernist, the work of Doris Clark in Peru. The most recent designer that became a focus of Sandra's critical scholarly gaze was the Cuban-born Claude Porcet, another itinerant designer who migrated and worked primarily in Mexico from the 1940s through to her death. Porcet worked in Mexico among an important cadre of artists and architects that included Diego Rivera and Juan O'Gorman and Luis Barragan. And her work, Sandra would better understand how modern design in Latin America could exist between, quote, as she would write, the technological utopia and the artisanal memory, end quote. Porcet deployed everyday materials with an ethos of organic design for affordability and mass production. And we could see this on the right through Porcet's competition design for MoMA, for which she was not credited. And this again speaks to, right, women in design and architecture, the perils of authorship erased in the male-dominant architecture and design world. Again, for Porcet, craft was vital and it marked the way in which furniture could expand from the interior across the threshold to the exterior. These photos are from an essay that Sandra wrote on Porcet's work in 2018. And so we see how Porcet's designs resonated with this transcultural adaptation of pre-Columbian forms on the left and craft detailing, and how they kind of worked closely, right, in the design on the right. And the way that Bobardi and Porcet eschewed the male tradition of building by adding design as well as transcultural expression highlighted complex histories across Latin America. And this spoke to Sandra's own experiences and what she wanted to invest her practice with. So writing on Porcet in 2018, she said of her own practice, quote, as a practicing architect, I, Sandra Vivanco, know the design process is similar to be independent of scale. Technical knowledge, cultural sensitivity, facility with form, and material expertise are the four main considerations, regardless of whether one is working with urban, landscape, architecture, interior, exhibit, furniture, object, or fashion design. So the question of scale intimates an important concept gleaned from her ongoing project of creating a genealogy and a resource of Latina modernist. That interest is reflected in the name of the firm, A+D, Architecture plus Design, the latter design encompassing multiple scales of craft. The scholarship was a parallel track that provided a conduit of ideas for A+D and for her teaching. Her cultural productions were informed by the complexities of cultural identity, gender, race, and ethnicity, urbanization, how political power and capitalism impacts how cities grow and who lives where, especially in a gentrifying city like San Francisco, and in craft, a way of building that takes into account material, cost, and culture. These experiments began at home with the house on the hill. Like Porcet, this project brings the interior to the exterior, expanding the social space of everyday life and how it opens on the second level to the back deck for children to play, and on the front to a deck on the third levels for parents to find refuge. The volumes emphasized through painted walls on the left, and you can see how the vertical space of the stair was inspired by Bobardi, like at the Casa do Bonin, and a mix of metal and wood. We could see this in the beautiful screen floor that is the upper landing of the project and the way light comes through that stair. So very much a Bobardian move. The playful Caesar-esque volumes of the upper level mass bedroom, and we see this with the closet and the bathroom mirror, whose details echoes the scales of the body and rituals of bathing and of personal scale. And again, the interior space of that unfolds outward, right, to a view of the city, and again, a space that connects interior to exterior. This is A+D's later screenhouse of 2009, and this addresses a different aspect of craft, cost, and aesthetics. Sandra was committed to transforming a Salvadorian American's family home while continuing to accommodate a multi-generational arrangement. At the forefront of this design was to utilize affordable materials that would enable the owners to completely upgrade both the interior and exterior, while being able to afford to remain in the community that was so familiar to their family for decades. For the exterior, A+D used APDM panels that is both cost-effective and sustainable. And A+D fabricated the screen that gives the house its name. Sandra placed this ornamental landscape. It's meant to sort of remind of the landscape of Salvador, formed by metal woven with Vero polyrod string that would serve as a marker of cultural identity for the Henriquez family who lived within the house. The detail, the kinetic screen as a marker of ownership and cultural identity, was used in a project around the same time for UCSF, Cesar Chavez Student Union Soul Food Cafe. UC San Francisco is the home to early Black ethnic studies program in the US that emerged from the 60s protests, and its students wanted a cafe that reflected the synthesis of African and American cuisines. A+D's clever response, again, to a limited budget and space, was to design an inviting screen structure that opened up to welcome customers, and that turned into, and A+D also turned an innovative venting solution into a sculpture, making the new cafe into a meeting place in a very busy nexus of student activity. And this was one of several projects that A+D did for educational institutions, including the San Francisco United School District. A scale shift occurred in her work when A+D was selected as one of the architects of record for the Mexican Museum at Yerba Buena Gardens Cultural Complex, adjacent to the Jewish Museum, designed by Daniel Libeskind. An important repository of Mexican culture, the museum would house 14,000 objects and serve as a vibrant location for the display of visual arts, for the experience of performing arts, and for education. So I think these projects further demonstrate how San Francisco served as the perfect cultural crucible for Sandra's wide range of interests and talents, precisely because of its rich Latinx history and also its global connections, its history of activism, and the architectural legacy of arts and crafts. The mission is an everyday place of, the mission is a place of everyday life as well as struggle. And she summarized this in the grant application, quote, "The mission has been my personal and professional home since I first moved to the US. Initially, I volunteered as an ESL student aide at the Mission Language Vocational School. And years later, I performed in many street festivals and theaters nearby. After graduate school, I moved back to the mission where my two daughters, seen here, Ima and Sophia, attended the local Spanish immersion elementary school. So the mission really was that place where all of these facets of her work could be engaged. And in a 2018 podcast, Sandra narrates how she moved to the mission. She was working downtown and she was teaching at CCA. And she shares that quote, "On my walk home, I noticed the day workers," quote. And so she proposed a home for a day laborers program to an organization that was dedicated to her needs. And we see here working with that group. CCA was welcome to this idea, and while it was a small project with a minimum grant funding, donated labor and materials, Sandra believed that these workers had the right to visibility, a right to the city, and that they deserve the absolute best design. She believed, quote, that dignity comes with being visible and having a place that they are proud of and that instills identity. Quote. Sandra believed the day laborers belonged in the mission. It was their home. And she worked with the day labor program to design their headquarters on Cesar Chavez. Its interior functions provided resources for their advocacy of fair wages and fair treatment, and provided workers with access so that they may find places for their families to live and remain in the neighborhood. Her design for the building's facade announced that it was an opening and inviting hub for workers and for advocates and for the community. And we can see here in the ways in which she proposed a kind of graphic, right, of the hands of craft of the workers, right, that would really mark, again, like a cultural identity, right, as ornament, as scaffold, right, as meaning for this place. With the Day Labor Project, her entrepreneurial spirit in bringing together many agents and stakeholders, Sandra forged a unique identity as an architect of community. Another project, Plaza Adelante, completed in 2009, again, brought together other architects like Gelfand Partners, the Mission Economic Development Association, to create a space in a former 3-story furniture store for several of the mission's non-profit organizations that provided services for housing and home ownership, small business incubation, digital literacy, and economic empowerment. While in this building, organizations kept their own identity, right? The details and the spaces of the semi-public and public areas knitted them together into a powerhouse advocacy community. And again, I mean, you could see the ways in which Sandra's using color to create a sort of volumetric expression within the main space of Plaza Adelante. As an early design build studio that led to the formation of Build Lab at CCA, Sandra in 2010 worked with 15 students to design and to construct 9 interventions, including a front desk seen here. You could see the details on the right, a cafe, a building history exhibit, Mercadito storefronts, and vending carts, one shown here, to enliven these collective spaces. So again, bringing her teaching, her activism, her practice, stakeholders, other architects together in one project. And she was incredibly adept and facile, right, at bringing all of these forces into one project. So I think this aptly demonstrates how Sandra almost effortlessly, it would seem, wove together her community work with her teaching, using cultural identity, her interest in craft, a sense of the city, learned from these explorations in her own experiences and understanding of Latin American modernism in architecture. When she joined the Art, Design, and Architecture School, that was known as CCAC, in 1997, it was a moment when the school was diversifying the curriculum and the faculty, and Sandra took on the Professor of Public Design, an innovative position that brought together many of her interests. So for her Diversity Studies Studio in 2012, Sandra and her students created Fluidez, a perfect encapsulation of practice as pedagogy. How does one take a group from a model seen here to a construction, to a site, albeit a moving one? And again, collaboration is at the foreground, working with a collaborative Sambache, which brought together CCA and a youth arts program, a Bada Capoeira, and a Bateria group, right? And so San Francisco's yearly Carnival Parade, a context that Sandra knew well, was perfect for an exploration, as she would write, of, quote, play and ritual, symbolic inversion, remembrance, otherness, and mask, connected to the exploration of the performing body and spectacle and the ritualized space of urban theater, of the urban theater of Carnival. Right. And in many ways, we see here, this is the Baroque. And yet here it is, it's in the streets, it's moving, and it's dynamic. And that's Sandra, as we can see on the right. So in the spirit of like Bobardi, thinking about the exhibition, Fluidez was exhibited in 2015 at Perspectivas, which was an exhibition organized by Latinos in Architecture as part of the AIA San Francisco Architecture and City Festival. And Sandra was an important member of that group, but this sense of bringing work not just in the studio, but to the street, but also to the public. And here it is again in this exhibition. So with the formation of Build Lab at CCA, Sandra continued to explore with her students and colleagues craft as digital fabrication that can animate the urban landscape of the city. So see here, always in the middle of it, just like Bobardi, like touching, constructing, working very directly, not only with material, but also with fabricators and with her students. The playful 826 Valencia shows Sandra in action, connecting pedagogy and practice, incited by the imagination. And in this case, the project known as the Enchanted Forest was for the Mission Bay 826 Valencia that teaches children the craft of writing. And I love at the bottom of their website is it's a writing lab for students to unleash their creativity. Right, and so this idea of an interior landscape of imagination, I think, was perfectly fit into this sort of magical reel, right, of the Baroque and its sensibility. Here's another image detail, right, with the central tree where books can be hung and people can engage. Right. So an incredible community landscape for teachers, for learners, for children, for adults. Right. And while Sandra was committed to expand education outside of the walls of the studio and into the city, she knew it was also, as she put it in our last conversation before she passed away, that it was vital to use education to show students the world. So one of her first travel studios involved a 3-school international collaboration that made urban proposals for an archaeological museum and botanical garden in the San Juan neighborhood of Xochimilco in Mexico City. Of this project, she would describe it as, quote, an interest in preserving the topographic features, ecological balance, and unique landscape is on the rise as cities around the world increase in size, consume land and finite resources, and become gradually less differentiated. So she recognized this was an incredibly unique landscape and artifact of, the character of Mexico City, and thinking about with students and with colleagues, what would it mean to try to preserve this, right? And to bring architecture as a way of publicly allowing the public to understand the vitality of this landscape. And as always, students learned a great deal in these studios, right? And this was a mid-review, and see here with her colleagues, Mark Anderson, Sekou Cook, Jordan Geiger, talking to the students about their various projects. And different projects. This is by Jose Brunner, who thought reclaiming the landscape would become a way to make an architecture and that could be a place for contemplation. Rosanna Harding in that studio explored notions of the archaeological layers, right, that Sandra had observed in childhood, understanding ways in which all of these things layered up, right, to inform a city, and what would it mean for that to become part of an archaeological center. Embracing Bobardi's, again, exhibitionary sensibility about sharing culture, the work of the 3 studios was exhibited at the Consulate of Mexico in 2003, right? And so that became, again, a way for students to understand how to bring their work in dialogue with the public, right? And to make these ideas public so that there can be a greater understanding of these important ideas of not only ecology, but also cultural identity and the way to challenge the voraciousness, right, of urbanization in cities like both Mexico City and San Francisco. So Sandra organized many travel studios to Peru, to Brazil, and to Mexico. And this gave her a platform to bring students to the very places and contexts that incited her own research, practice, and pedagogy, and explore further on site the themes of the Baroque and Latin American modernists. On these trips, she would show her students and colleagues and friends the variegated landscape of Lima and Cusco, of Rio's neighborhoods of Rocinha and Ipanema, and her daughters, Ima and Sophia, were enlisted as apt translators and assistants. Learning for Sandra was always a family affair. Students and colleagues would not only see icons of modernism, Bobardi, Niemeyer, Barragan, and Chetto, but also meet with artists, performers, urbanists, activists, scholars, and students and educators in other schools, and in locations often on site for intense engagements and collaborations. And this is a great photograph on the left, and you can see Sandra, Ima, and Sophia in this, but also Lisa Finlay and her husband, Rod Hemney. So she often brought colleagues and friends along with her to meet and learn from these various contexts. So in 2018, Sandra brought many of these interests together in a summer exchange studio with students and faculty from CCA. She and CCA colleague Adam Marcus joined UNAM faculty in Mexico City, Marcela Delgado, Elena Tudela, and Diego Recalde in Mexico City. And under, the umbrella of what was called culturas materiales, or material cultures. And so how fitting a theme as she continued her work on figures like Clara Percet and continued to work on the Mexican Museum. Through her various networks, Sandra set up a studio space at the Casa Estudio Max Jetta, who was a collaborator of Barragán and Juan O'Gorman. And students spent time at the twin houses, as you can see on the right, by O'Gorman, that he designed for Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. Cultural identity is not only defined by architecture, but note the incredible colors, right? And in contrast, right, of this wall at Barragán against the rough grain of the benches. But it was also food, right? And community that is always a register, right, of cultural identity and cultural vibrancy. And that was something these studios, travel studios, also experienced. So in this trip to Mexico City, students from both institutions collaborated on these magnificent constructions that culminated in an exhibition at UNAM, right? And here we see that work on display, the students and the faculty sort of talking about the work, and and we get a sense from that, like the ways in which that studio took domestic objects and raised them to high art and architecture, the everyday and the ordinary, corn husks or shopping bag fabric. So in 2018, Sandra received a prestigious Stuart Keefe LeBrun travel grant from New York's AIA to pursue her work, quote, "The Feminine and the Modern, 6 Pioneer Architects in Latin America," quote. And so she and Glenn returned to Mexico City for 5 months so that she could work in the archives of Clara Percet. It was just as she was to prepare for this trip that she received a diagnosis of the return of cancer. But that did not stop her. She went to Mexico City, and as always, she dispatched an open invitation for family and friends. And she and Glenn were joined on several occasions by her daughters, Ima and Sophia, along with other friends in this remarkable city where art, architecture, and life blend in a riotous fashion. My visit to Mexico City is where I learned on a rainy June afternoon that food markets yield the most perfect combination of gastronomy and art. A hot bowl of seafood soup, a delightful beer, the largest bag of cheese doodles in the world. Sandra and I could not stop laughing about this huge bag. And a sweeping bas-relief mural of Mexican history by Isamu Noguchi. Sandra knew that as a woman of color, she would have to invent her practice. So she did, A+D. Her work was so way ahead of the curve that institutions and professions didn't always recognize as credible or relevant the work that she produced. So it was heartwarming and deeply satisfying to see Sandra receive acknowledgement for her extraordinary body of work by her respective communities, like the SFAIA's Community Alliance Award in 2017, and the ACSA, for those who don't know, that's the Architectural Educators Association National Design Education Award in 2019, that she left Mexico City to fly, I think, to Pittsburgh to receive that award in 2019. Sandra tirelessly mentored many young architects. Through her service, she remained committed to increasing the number of women architects and architects of color. But if anything, for all of us who knew her, she was indefatigable. If something wasn't there, she made it, and she made a space for it. For her students, she did this for her colleagues, her collaborators, and for her friends and her family. We miss her dearly, but her spirit lives on in our hearts, which will always beat in samba time. So until soon. Thank you, and all of those who made this first Sandra I. Vivanco lecture possible. And I hope I captured what a remarkable person we were all fortunate to have in our lives. So I was hoping that our Q&A could be an opportunity to share stories about Sandra and to say thank you for her amazing gift to us all. Thank you.